Hi everybody. Welcome to week 5. Week 5 is going to highlight a different scene, as you can see. And also we're going to be talking tonight about learning. Learning is probably one of the most important sections that you'll have in your entire process. Why is that? Because learning is the mechanism by which we absorb everything in our environment, right? And that's how we develop each different stage of our personality. So that's why learning is such an important chapter. It's actually more than one chapter, and we're going to be going over a couple of different types of learning. But the main types of learning that we're going to look at are classical conditioning and operant conditioning. We'll break this up into two different recordings for you because it's very, very important to pay attention to the different processes when we talk about learning. We're going to start with a definition for learning, and this is a very important part of the process to understand what we mean by learning. First thing is that learning is a very key process in human behavior. And our working definition is that is defined as any relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of practice or experience. Any relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of practice or experience. Now I'm going to break that down for you a little bit so you understand what we mean by that definition. First thing, learning is a change in behavior. What that basically means is something has had to change. So if you just have somebody talking at you, but you don't absorb any of the information, then you haven't learned anything. It's just been put out there. It's like the tree falling in the forest. So we are talking now about classical conditioning or Pavlovian learning. One of the things that you want to know about classical conditioning is it's so important because it's the most basic type of learning that we can define, and it starts right as you're an infant. In fact, many people believe that there's classical conditioning of sorts in utero, but for sure we can observe classical conditioning as soon as the infant comes out. So it's really important to understand that classical conditioning has to be looked at and defined. In addition to which, one of the things that's so important is that our likes and our dislikes are probably classically conditioned into us at a very young and early age. For instance, a fear or a phobia that you have, let's say a fear of heights, right? You might have a fear of heights and you don't even know why. That's the case in as my example, and or you might have a fear of flying, or some of these things may develop and you don't even know why. Sometimes you do, but a lot of times you don't. Part of the reason for that is because many of these fears are classically conditioned into us at a very young age. Sometimes before we're even conscious of what the association is. So you can have something happen to you very early in childhood, age 1 or 2, and it could very well lead to something that has been paired and classically conditioned into you, like a fear or even a preference, and at a very young age these have been determined and you have no idea where it came from. So that's very common. So that's one of the reasons we want to understand classical conditioning so well. Classical conditioning, as I mentioned before, was discovered by Ivan Pavlov. He was a Russian doing experiments on dog salivation, of all things. And really what he was looking for, as in many great discoveries, he was not looking for anything along the lines of classical conditioning. He was really looking for the amount of saliva that a dog produces when meat is introduced to them. They wanted to find out quantities of saliva that's being produced and why it was being produced. And so they were looking into that as a study. Well, lo and behold, something happened during this study that led Pavlov to understand that there was an association that was being made. Okay, so we're going to lay that out for you so you understand where it comes from. Let's start by defining classical conditioning, and we'll call this Pavlovian learning. And basically, so to clarify what this is, two stimuli are presented to the learner. All right, that's the subject of the experiment. In the case of Pavlov, a dog, it could be an experiment with a human or anybody else in this type of experiment. And one of those stimuli is the CS, or the conditioned stimulus. Okay, the conditioned stimulus does not in itself evoke a specific response, except an alerting response, like something is going to happen. Anything which is detectable can be used as the conditioned stimulus. So that most times in an experiment you'll find it's a bell or a light or something that a noise of some sort. Any of those things can act as a conditioned stimulus. But remember, that in and of itself doesn't produce a response in the learner. The other stimulus presented is called the US, or the unconditioned stimulus. This stimulus does evoke a response or is reliably followed by one. As a for instance, an unconditioned stimulus for humans, if you go to the eye doctor and you get an examination, they do a puff of air into your eye. And what happens when you get that puff of air into your eye? You blink, right? So that's not a response that you have to be taught. That's why we call it an unconditioned stimulus. It's a response that you have even if you're not trained to have it. Okay? So the response that follows the unconditioned stimulus is the unconditioned response. That's another term, and that's called the UR, abbreviated the UR. And the unconditioned response happens following the unconditioned stimulus. So it's just what I described. If you go to the eye doctor and you have a puff of air in your eye, that's the unconditioned stimulus. It produces the unconditioned response, which is the blink that you have in response to the puff of air in your eye, right? So in classical conditioning, what happens is the conditioned stimulus, the CS, and the unconditioned stimulus, the US, are paired together. They follow each other very shortly, right? So the conditioned stimulus comes very shortly before the unconditioned stimulus. After they've been paired a few times, right, then the conditioned stimulus itself evokes a response that we call the conditioned response, right? And the conditioned response is the classical conditioning part of it, right? So maybe if you go to the eye doctor and you've been getting that puff of air in your eye, when you hear the machine go on, automatically you blink because you're anticipating that you're going to get that puff of air in your eye. That would be something that would be classically conditioned into you, right? What happens is the more pairing of the unconditioned stimulus, or the US, with the CS, the stronger the conditioned response becomes. The stronger the conditioned response becomes. It's a gradual process up to a point, and then it sort of peaks out because the response can't get much stronger. So you can see that if they put you in an experiment with a puff of air in your eye, the more times they did that, the more pairings they had with that. When you heard the machine turn on, you'd be more likely to blink, right? So it's the same thing when we apply that to Pavlovian or classical conditioning. Okay, so now I'm going to explain to you exactly how the experiment that Pavlov ran relates to the terms I just gave you, right? So in Pavlov's experiment, as I said, he was looking to study salivary response in dogs, right? So it turned out that the experimenters he was using, there was a bell attached to the, or a chime attached to the door that was the entrance to the laboratory. And that what they would find is they'd hook the dogs up into the harnesses, and they'd start to measure the amount of saliva they were producing. And of course, what would be happening is as the door was open and the bell rang, right, that would be shortly followed by the presentation of the meat to the dog. Okay, so what happened was the bell would come through initially from the door opening, and the dog would initially have no response to it, right? That was our conditioned stimulus. It just alerted the dog that something was about to happen, but it didn't in itself produce saliva to hear the bells. But that was followed by, right afterwards, the presentation of the food to the dog. right? That's our unconditioned stimulus. We didn't have to train, Pavlov didn't have to train the dog to respond to the presentation of the meat. They started salivating, right? Well, after a period of time, the dogs began to salivate, and Pavlov noticed this, began to salivate when the experimenter walked through the door and the chimes went off, right? The bell went off. So suddenly there had been a pairing of the sound of that bell going off and the presentation of the food. When that happened, guess what? Now you get what we call the conditioned response. That's classical conditioning. The pairing had taken place, so now when the dog heard the bell, the experimenter going through the door, they would start to salivate. Even if the meat wasn't present, they would still salivate. That's a conditioned response, right? And we could tell that, Pavlov could tell that because they started getting this conditioned response and the dog salivating only to the bell ringing, right? They would start to increase their amount of saliva that was produced just to the sound of the bell, right? So this was a very important discovery. So Pavlov, in his experiments, started to vary what they called the conditioned stimulus. They wanted to make sure they would get that same amount of response to anything they used as a learning response. So they started using different things, like they used lights, different color lights. They used a metronome, making tick-tock noise that was paired with the presentation of food. And it turned out basically that anything that was paired with the presentation of food, after a period of time, you could get a conditioned response to that stimuli, whether it was a bell or a buzzer or a metronome. It didn't really matter. You still got the response just from the pairing with the presentation of food. So over time, that was an important discovery, right? So in order to make sure you really understand about classical conditioning, now I'm going to tell you a story that is about me, which is a semi-true story. You'll figure out the parts that are true, right? And let's try to identify in your notebook. Let's try to identify the four identifiers that we want to have, the four terms that we want to have down for classical conditioning. You're going to write down CS, you're going to write down US, you're going to write down UR, and you're going to write down CR. So in the story I'm telling you, let's try to find out what it is that was the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, and finally the conditioned response. Okay? So as I'm telling you the story, listen to it, try to identify, and write down into those categories. So here's the story that I wanted to tell you. So a long time ago, when I bought my first house, and this was a long time ago, the plumbing was connected to each other. So unfortunately, in the old houses, sometimes when people flush the toilet in one bathroom, the other bathroom would be affected by that. And in my first house, the plumbing was all connected. So one day I was in the shower and I'm scrubbing up, right, having a good time, getting all clean, and I hear the toilet flush in the other bathroom upstairs. Excuse me. So now suddenly all the cold water drains because of the flush, and the water on my shower becomes scalding hot. And I jump out of the shower, and I'm dripping soap all over the place, running down the hallway saying, "Stop flushing, stop flushing." Okay? So this happens a couple of times where I'm in the shower, and then I hear the toilet flushing. By the second or third time I heard the toilet flushing, guess what? I'm not waiting to be scalded by hot water. As soon as I hear that toilet flush, I jump out of the way of the water so I don't get burned, right? Something has happened here. There's learning that's taken place because now I'm no longer waiting to get burned by the scalding hot water. I know that's coming when I hear the flushing of the toilet. Okay, now I want to take a minute for you all to identify in your book the CS, the US, the UR, and the CR. Okay? That's the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, and the conditioned response. In my story, what would you label which one of these identifiers? Okay? Write it down. I'll give you a second. And be as specific as possible because you don't want to be vague about what it is. Okay? So here we go. That was your Jeopardy metronome. So let's go through and identify those stimuli, right, and the responses. So the first one that we want to identify is the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus in my story is the sound of the toilet. Why? Because initially when I heard the toilet flushing in the other bathroom, I didn't necessarily have a response to it. But eventually I realized, aha, it's an alerting response that something else is going to happen. So in my story, the conditioned stimulus is the sound of the toilet flushing. Hopefully you had that. Okay. The second identifier is the unconditioned stimulus. What was the unconditioned stimulus? Well, in my story, the unconditioned stimulus is the burning hot scalding water that comes down in my shower. Why? Because there's nothing I had to learn about being scalded and jumping out of the way, right? I'm not going to stand there. I'm going to have a response. So the unconditioned stimulus was the burning water. You didn't have to teach me that that was not fun. Okay? The third identifier is the unconditioned response. Okay? The unconditioned response in my story, jumping out of the way of the steaming hot water. Okay? Jumping out of the way of the water. So that was the unconditioned response. Why? Because when I felt the unconditioned stimulus, the burning hot water, nobody had to tell me jump out of the way of the water. No learning need take place there. Now we come to the cruncher, which is the conditioned response. What is the conditioned response in the story? That is the jumping out of the way to the sound of the toilet flushing. That's the conditioned response. Why? Because now I don't wait to get burned by the hot water. As soon as I hear that noise, I'm jumping out of the way. Okay? Learning has taken place. I made an association of the sound of the toilet flushing to getting scalded. To avoid that, I have a response. We call this the conditioned response, jumping out of the way of the scalding hot water. The sound of the toilet flushing, I'm sorry, is the condition. So the change also must be relatively permanent. Depending on what the task is, it has to be a relatively permanent change, which means that, again, if it's just an instantaneous thing and not comprehended, then it's not really learning that's taking place. So all of those elements of the definition for learning are extremely important. So you have to start with learning, and the first type of learning we're going to start with is actually classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is also known as Pavlovian learning. Pavlovian learning named after Ivan Pavlov, who was the one who discovered classical conditioning or Pavlovian learning. Also, there are several definitions that fit in with classical conditioning that you should know. Let's talk about the term extinction. Okay, what does extinction mean in classical conditioning? Well, what it means is that this occurs when the conditioned stimulus is presented without the unconditioned stimulus over a number of trials. This will gradually reduce the strength of the conditioned response, right? So let's say you, in Pavlov's experiment, as a for instance, let's say you hear the experimenter coming through, the bell rings, but there's no meat presented to the dog, right? The first several times that's going to happen, the dog is still going to have a response to the bell going off. But eventually, that response will die out. As the meat is not presented following the experimenter coming through and the bell's ringing, eventually the response is going to gradually die down to where you're not getting the response anymore. How does that happen? Well, that's extinction. That's what we call extinction. And basically it means that the response that you've trained up, the classically conditioned response that you've trained up, is going to die away because you keep presenting the conditioned stimulus without the pairing of the conditioned response. Okay? So that's very important to acknowledge that extinction can happen. So in Pavlov's setup, as I said, if the bell is consistently presented alone, gradually less and less salivation will occur until finally there's no salivation at all within a given trial. Now, this part is a little bit confusing. The next term is called spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery is something that even psychologists don't thoroughly understand. But basically, what it means is if an animal has been in an experiment and they've undergone extinction, purposely we asked to try to have a response die out, right? So we put the dog in the experiment, in the cage, we ring the bell, no meat presented, eventually saliva is not produced just to the sound of the bell, right? So now you think that the animal doesn't remember, right? No response to the bell. Well, we have this phenomenon called spontaneous recovery. And what happens is, if you put the animal back in the experimental setting, into the same cage, and you ring the bell again, the response will kick up again. We don't know why this happens. It's almost like a little bit of the memory remains so that the animal starts to respond again. This is what we call spontaneous recovery. What that means for experimenters is that normally you have to put an animal, if you want to kind of wipe out their memory of what the experiment that we're in, you have to put them into the experimental situation 3 or 4 separate times in order for the response to die out completely, right? So this is why classical conditioning is so strong, because if it was a behavior where an association was made even at a young age, sometimes it can carry on well into adulthood. Okay, so spontaneous recovery makes it a little tricky. And again, what we know about that is that several extinction sessions may be necessary if you are trying to really get the animal back to being naive in the experimental setting or not responding. Second term I wanted to tell you about was reconditioning. Reconditioning to a conditioned stimulus is faster than the original conditioning. All right. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, basically, it means that if you put an animal into an experiment and you put them through all the extinction, right, and now you know that you put them into an experiment and they no longer respond with salivation when the bell rings, right? What happens is if you put them back into an experimental situation where they get presented with a bell and then powder, meat powder, bell, meat, if you make that association again, their ability to recondition again is much, much faster, right? So it only takes 1 or 2 trials and the animal is responding as if they're right back into their original response pattern. That's interesting because it may very well apply to human beings and our responses, right? And what I would say is, like smokers, as a for instance, if they learn to disassociate things that they love about smoking, like after a meal or with a cup of coffee, if they finally let that die out and they're non-smokers, but they then make the mistake of saying, well, I'll just have one with my coffee or something along those lines. If they do that, because of reconditioning, because it happens so much faster, they get sucked back into cigarette addiction much more quickly, which is why it's usually very difficult for anyone with an addictive personality to drink a little bit or to smoke cigarettes a little bit, because it happens so much more quickly that you get reconditioned and those associations come flooding back to you, right? So that's why reconditioning is so much faster. Now I have one last term that I want to talk to you about, which is stimulus generalization. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story about little Albert and the white rabbit. Right now, this was an experiment that was done many years before ethics were involved in experimentation. Right, ethics are very important in experimentation because now we know, as you've read in your book, that when you do an experiment, you want to make sure you have something called informed consent. You want to make sure that the person or the parent of the child has full knowledge of what you're trying to do, and that you're guaranteeing that going into the experiment, you're going to basically come out the same way, both psychologically and physically, right? But back in the day, when experimentation was not as sophisticated and the ethics weren't followed in the same way, there was the experiment involving little Albert, and we still talk about it today to talk about this phenomenon of stimulus generalization. When a response is trained to a particular stimuli, if the associations are made to other things that are close to that original stimuli, it can elicit a response. Okay, sometimes very good, sometimes not so good. I'll give you the example of what happened with little Albert. Little Albert, his mom agreed to put him into an experiment, and there was a white rabbit within the experiment, right? And they were looking to see what his response was going to be. He was like a 2-year-old at the time. So they bring little Albert in, and they sit him in the room, and they bring in the white rabbit, and little Albert crawls toward the bunny to see if he could touch him. And while that's happening, the experimenters sneak behind little Albert, and they clang two cymbals very loudly behind his head. And the infant startles and starts crying because that's an unpleasant experience for the infant. So the experimenters say, okay, we noted the response, take little Albert out. They put him back into the experiment the next day, and lo and behold, they put him in with the rabbit. Now little Albert's a little more anxious about interacting with the rabbit, not knowing what might happen. And sure enough, they come behind Albert and they crash the cymbals, and again he starts crying. Okay? The mother's questioning what's going on. They say, don't worry about it, we got it. Okay, now little Albert comes back for the third day of the experiment, and they put him in the room, and now Albert's trying to get away because he's fidgeting and he knows that something bad might happen. And at the minute they put the rabbit into the room and sneak behind and crash the cymbals, Albert starts crying, crying, crying. Now the mother says, hey, wait a minute. I don't want this. This is not what I want for my child. I'm taking this kid out of the experiment, right? The experimenters say, wait a minute, we're going to decondition him. We're going to fix him not to respond to the white rabbit in that way. But the mother did not trust them, right? She takes little Albert out of the experiment, and now little Albert has a classically conditioned fear of these white rabbits. Well, guess what happens? A couple of years later, little Albert is online to see Santa Claus because it's Christmas time. And he's online at the mall, and he's with his mother and happy, and the mother's saying, yeah, you're going to get presents from Santa, you're going to ask Santa what you want, etc., like most little kids. Well, they get up on the front of the line, and little Albert walks towards Santa, and suddenly he freezes. And he starts crying uncontrollably, and the mother says, what's wrong? It's Santa. And he yells and runs away down the hallway of the mall, and the mother chases after him. What's the matter, Albert? What's the matter with you? What was the matter with little Albert? Well, what happened was he saw the white beard of Santa Claus, right? And what did it do? It reminded Albert of the memory that he had of the association that was made with that white beard looked like the fluffy bunny, right? So this we call stimulus generalization, something that a fear that was trained into him in a very specific way to the rabbit, to the fluffy rabbit, was brought about by the white beard of Santa Claus. And now, where there's a grown-up adult somewhere who's deathly afraid of Christmas. How do you like that? Well, we didn't know at the time. The good news is anything that you learn via classic conditioning or the next section that we're going to talk about, operant conditioning, can be unlearned. So what does that mean? That means there are techniques to help you if you have something classically conditioned that you don't want. Let's say, as a for instance, a fear of flying, right? Well, there are classes you can take to help you reduce gradually your response to the fear of flying, the anxiety you feel about that, right? So anything that you learn through classical conditioning or operant conditioning can be unlearned, and that's good news because many of our fears and desires are classically conditioned at a very, very young age, usually before we are conscious of what's going on. So That's the first part of learning. I want you to look at the experiment in your book also and make sure that you have a clear understanding of what Pavlovian learning is, because that's going to be important going forward. When you view the next tape, you are going to see a presentation about operant conditioning and B.F. Skinner. That's Burris Frederick Skinner. Skinner is going to give us a totally different take on behaviorism and learning. All right, consequence-based learning. That's what we're going to learn about. Also, I'm going to give you a special preview, which is I work at the hospital at Pilgrim Psychiatric Center, and I teach the psychologists there a way of looking at reinforcement behavior principles that is kind of unique. So I'm going to give that to you also with an explanation on this film. Okay, so I hope to see you real soon. Come back again. Be there. Aloha. See you for number 6.